Hi guys, this is the intro to Reconstruction. So there'll be different videos in this unit. This is intro to Reconstruction, and then we will have a separate video on Grant and Hayes, and then we'll have a separate video on the Electoral College. Okay, so this is Reconstruction and Andrew Johnson. Reconstruction, that is basically what is happening after the Civil War ends. So the Union wins, and it's not like everything just goes back to the way it was. There's a period of time where there's a lot of violence and still a lot of division. So we saw in our last videos about talking about our buddy Babe Lincoln here. Let me get him in frame. Our buddy Babe Lincoln being shot and killed, assassinated. We talked about the assassins in the other video. If you haven't watched that video yet, go watch it. But Babe Lincoln dies, and they end up preserving his body and actually taking his body in kind of a tour around the country so that all Americans can say goodbye. They have these different stops along the way where they'll have mass viewing sessions where people can actually walk up to the casket and say goodbye to Lincoln. We have him parading through the streets in like a clear buggy like this. This was the funeral train route, so it was starting in Washington, D.C. and going up and ending in Springfield because, as we know, Illinois, our motto for our state is Land of Lincoln. So we are just Lincoln obsessed here. I was telling the class, Lincoln sneezes on a handkerchief and boom, it's in a museum. Lincoln's handkerchief that he sneezed on. We're Lincoln obsessed. But, so we see the funeral train kind of going through. I think it's kind of creepy, TBH. I'm with Thomas right here. It's a little like, carting a dead body across the country. But that's how beloved this man was, right? They needed to say goodbye. Everybody in the country needed to say goodbye to him. So entering the Reconstruction, I like to think of the South as Humpty Dumpty. So the South was sitting on the wall, right? They had their agricultural economy that was making them a lot of money, and a lot of these big plantations weren't doing much of the work, right? They left that up to the slaves. So they're sitting on the wall here, life is good. Well then, the Civil War happens, that ends, the South loses, and they end up in pieces on the ground, just like Humpty Dumpty sat on the wall, and then Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. So they are on the ground in pieces, and here are kind of some of the different pieces. Sorry, babe, I'm gonna move you. We have railroads and shipping destroyed. We also have 1/5 of adult men were killed or injured. So not only do we have dead people, we also have injured people at the end of this war. And if you know anything about being injured, it's kind of hard to work, right? So we have that that they're dealing with in the South. We also have farmland destroyed. The farmland, like we said, was a big part of the Southern economy. And with the war happening on both sides of the North and South, it's not like they would come, the soldiers would march up to a farm and be like, oh, sorry, we're not going to fight here. We understand this is your land. We're not going to mess it up. They weren't doing any of that. They would fight wherever they were, okay? So that's what they're destroying farmland. We also have huge plantations losing labor. So since the North wins, the South, with the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment, freeing the slaves in the South, they're losing a lot of labor. We'll see in next week about kind of how they get around that, and they kind of find a loophole, which is not great. But we also have Confederate currency being worthless. So they had made their own money when the Confederacy separated from the Union, and now, since the war was over and the Confederacy was no more, their money is worthless. We also have 4 million jobless and homeless in the South. There's a lot of refugees coming out of this war. Okay, either their homes were destroyed or enslaved people who are now free. They're kind of wondering what their next step is. in that too. So that's kind of like an analogy of Humpty Dumpty sat on the wall, and then eventually at the end of the war we see it on the ground. Reconstruction presidents. So today we're going to talk mostly about Andrew Johnson. In the next video we'll talk about Ulysses S. Grant and Rutherford B. Hayes, but we'll focus on Andrew Johnson, who came right after this man here. You'll remember him as the vice president to Lincoln's presidency. So since Lincoln dies, right, we talked about that hierarchy. Lincoln dies, Andrew Johnson moves up as president. So a little bit about Andrew Johnson. He's kind of an old-fashioned Southern dude. He's a Democrat, and he had pronounced states' rights views. Okay, so he had that kind of view that slavery had been in the South for a long time, and it was the states' rights to kind of uphold that. So very different than Lincoln, right, his running mate. But we remember that our buddy here had some pretty weird views on slavery, especially when he was in the Lincoln-Douglas debates. So again, kind of similar, kind of not. So he was a super big champion of what's called like the common man, like the everyday dude, especially with small farmers. He rejected the idea of these huge plantations, and he really advocated for small farms and small farmers. So I have here, I'm just like you, except not, but for reals, I'm just like you, because I think a lot of the time we have politicians trying to find common ground with us as people, right? I used an example in class of like a politician going to a local ice cream shop and being like, oh yeah, this is what I do all the time, you know, I'm one of you, I get ice cream with my kids too. But we see a lot of advocacy from him for small farms. This was a quote that I thought was funny of Andrew Johnson. He said, if I'm shot at all, I want no man to be in the way of the bullet. I think that's kind of funny just because he knows he was kind of controversial, right? So he's saying, you know what, if somebody has a problem with me, let them have a clear shot. What's funny about this slide is, this is Oprah, if you didn't know. And Oprah was known to hand out cars in her show, like, you get a car, you get a car. You probably heard that before. But I have this here because Andrew Johnson, after the war, is giving pardons, just like Oprah gave out cars, to any war criminal, Confederate sympathizer, okay, that will take an oath back to the United States. So we saw the Confederacy separate from the United States, and they were committing treason, right? So we see them all coming in, and he's like, as long as you take an oath, I'll give you a pardon. And we see that he has pardoned a lot of the people involved in Babe Lincoln, his assassination attempt, okay? So as long as you're taking an oath, he's giving you a pardon. The Freedmen's Bureau. This was a campaign for refugees on both sides. It gave out clothes, medical supplies, and meals to both black and white refugees. It also provided education to these people, which was revolutionary, right? Especially for African Americans who were enslaved. And it was unfortunately not supported by Congress and eventually died in 1869. But there's kind of some controversy with Andrew Johnson and this bill, and we'll see that in a minute. So Andrew Johnson ends up vetoing this a bunch of times. It goes back and forth. If you don't know what a veto is, it's basically a big fat no from the president. And the good thing about that is we have checks and balances. Okay, so if Congress is really pushing one thing but the president vetoes it, Congress can override it. And it goes back and forth between Congress and the president 29 times, which is pretty significant. And we'll see this relationship between Johnson and Congress does not get any better as his presidency goes on. Same with the Civil Rights Bill of 1875. I have this picture. If we remember Charles Sumner, the guy that got beaten with the cane, right? He was a huge champion of the Civil Rights Bill of 1875. This bill actually guaranteed African Americans equal treatment in public places. It was passed by overriding or canceling out the president's veto, During his presidency, Congress overrided Johnson's veto 15 times. That's a lot. Okay, so you can see the really butting heads here, and that comes to an end here in a minute. So this is where Congress is kind of setting a trap for Johnson. They passed the Tenure of Office Act, which basically says that he is not allowed to fire anybody without approval from Congress. Okay, you can't fire anybody without going through Congress and checking in with them. So they set this trap of the tenure of office, and unfortunately, Johnson takes the bait and he fires his Secretary of War, which was against the Tenure of Office Act, and he is actually impeached, which we will learn about in the next video. But we have the Star Wars name, rest in power. He died in the, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to spoil it, but unfortunately, he dies. I can't remember his name though. You remember his name? Let me know. But this is just to show that it's a trap for Andrew Johnson, right? He is the mouse. Tenure of Office Act is the mouse trap. So in the next video, we will talk about impeachment. See you in a bit.